The most terrifying thing about Lioness Season 3, Episode 4 isn't that Joe McNamara has been kidnapped. It's that the CIA may completely misunderstand the war they're fighting. Because while everyone in Washington is treating Joe's capture like a straightforward Russian operation, the details surrounding her disappearance suggest something far more calculated. Joe isn't simply being held for information. The Russians aren't behaving like an enemy that wants revenge. And the closer Caitlin Meade, Byron Westfield, Kyle, and the rest of the team get to rescuing Joe, the more obvious it becomes that they may be reacting exactly the way their enemy expected. The question isn't just where Joe is, the question is who is actually controlling this operation, and why does it feel like the CIA is always one step behind? Episode 4 immediately makes one thing clear. Joe is alive for a reason. She's been tortured for days, yet her captors aren't rushing to kill her. Renat keeps talking to her, trying to break her psychologically, trying to convince her that she represents everything wrong with the West. And Joe, even while restrained and exhausted, understands something important. These people aren't simply trying to extract information. They're trying to make a statement. Joe is being treated like a symbol. She's the Lioness, one of the most experienced operators the CIA has. If an enemy can capture her alive, move her through American territory, and potentially transfer her to another hostile government, the humiliation goes far beyond one officer being taken. It becomes a demonstration that the American intelligence machine can be penetrated, manipulated, and forced to react. And that's where the episode's title, Murder Hornets, becomes much more interesting. Earlier in the timeline, Joe explains that sometimes you don't go directly after the Queen. You go after the worker bees. You follow the network, identify the connections, and slowly work your way towards the real target. That's how Joe operates. She understands asymmetric warfare because she's lived inside it for years. But what if this season is turning that philosophy against her? What if the enemy has studied the CIA closely enough to understand how Joe thinks? What if they aren't attacking the Queen at all? What if Joe is one of the worker bees they're using to flush out something much bigger? Look at the reaction to her disappearance. The CIA doesn't sit back and gather information. They explode into action. Caitlin is under enormous pressure. Byron is trying to understand the diplomatic consequences. Secretary Mullins is being forced to consider involving the president. Kyle and the team are moving aggressively, eventually crossing a line when Kyle kills a Russian to get the aircraft's tail number. That's an extraordinary reaction, and the Russians get to observe every part of it. They get to see how quickly the CIA responds. They get to see who takes command. They get to see which assets are activated. They get to see how far the Americans are willing to go when one of their own is captured. That means Joe's kidnapping could be functioning as reconnaissance. The Russians may not need Joe to reveal every secret in her head. They may simply need to watch what America does when she disappears. And suddenly, Kyle's decision to kill for information becomes even more dangerous. He gets the tail number, but the aircraft's transponder has already been disabled. They're still behind. They know the plane exists, but they don't know where it's going. They know Joe is being moved, but they don't know the final destination. And every time they react, the enemy seems to have another layer waiting for them. That's not how a simple hostage operation looks. That's how a carefully constructed intelligence operation looks. And there is another detail that makes this even more disturbing. Joe herself knows they're not telling her everything. She's being waterboarded and psychologically pressured, but she's still studying the people around her. She's testing her restraints. She's trying to leave evidence behind. She understands that her captors have a purpose for keeping her alive. That's why her defiance matters. Joe isn't simply trying to survive. She's trying to understand the operation from the inside, and if Joe realizes that she's being used as a piece in a larger game, then the situation becomes much more dangerous. Because the CIA is trying to rescue Joe, Joe is trying to understand her captors. But the people behind the operation may be watching both sides. That's the possibility that changes everything. Think about the mystery surrounding the Alexei Yurimov operation. The Americans already carried out an operation that angered the Russians and created the possibility of retaliation. Everyone naturally assumes Joe's capture is connected to that. It makes sense. The Russians want revenge. Joe is a senior CIA officer with knowledge of the Middle East, and transferring her to Iran would create enormous political leverage. But that's almost too obvious. What if Yurimov was only the excuse? What if Joe's capture was planned for a completely different reason? The Russians may have realized that Joe is one of the few people capable of connecting several operations that Washington doesn't realize are connected. Taking her off the board could accomplish two things simultaneously: remove one of America's most experienced operators and force the CIA to expose how much it actually knows. And that's why the possibility of Iran is so terrifying. If Jo reaches Iran, she doesn't simply become a prisoner, she becomes a political weapon. Her knowledge could be exploited. Her capture could be publicized. Her interrogation could become propaganda. And Washington would have to decide whether rescuing one CIA officer is worth risking an international confrontation. That's the trap. The Americans cannot simply bomb their way out of it. They can't publicly admit exactly what Jo knows. They can't allow Iran or Russia to parade her around. And they can't negotiate without revealing how valuable she really is. So the enemy has created a situation where every possible response carries a cost. And that's exactly what makes the operation so sophisticated. But there is another layer that Episode 4 quietly introduces through Jo's family. When Caitlin visits Neil, she doesn't give him certainty. She gives him possibilities. Maybe they get Jo back quickly. Maybe negotiations take months or years. Or maybe Jo doesn't come home. That scene isn't just there to make us feel the emotional cost of Jo's disappearance. It's showing us the weakness behind the machine. Because Jo may be one of the most dangerous people in the CIA, but she's also a wife and a mother. And the people trying to rescue her know that. The people holding her know that. If the enemy can turn Jo's family into another pressure point, they can make the CIA even more unpredictable. And that's what this season has been building towards. The world of Lioness has always been about the collision between professional violence and personal consequences. Jo can operate in darkness because she believes she's protecting her country and her family. But now that darkness has followed her home, the enemy has taken the Lioness, and America is sending the entire hive after her. But what if that's exactly what they wanted? Imagine the possibility that Jo's capture wasn't designed to destroy the CIA. It was designed to make the CIA reveal itself. Every decision becomes intelligence. Every rescue attempt becomes information. Every operative who gets involved becomes another piece of the puzzle. And suddenly the phrase, "go get our girl," becomes much more dangerous. Because yes, they need to get Jo back, but they also need to understand who they're fighting before they walk into the next stage of the operation. The flashback gives us the answer to how Jo normally handles a problem like this. She studies the worker bees. She finds the network. She identifies the queen. But in the present, she may have become the worker bee, and the CIA hasn't found the queen. Not yet. That's why I don't think the biggest reveal of this season will simply be that Russia kidnapped Jo or that Iran is involved. Those are pieces of the board. The real revelation could be that Russia isn't operating alone. Someone may be coordinating between intelligence services, criminal networks, and political interests. Someone who understands how Washington reacts. Someone who understands Jo. Someone who knows that taking her alive would create maximum pressure. And if that person is still hidden, then the CIA isn't fighting the enemy they've identified. They're fighting the enemy they've been allowed to see. That's the terrifying possibility Episode 4 leaves us with. Jo is alive. The CIA is searching. The Russians are moving. Iran may be waiting. Washington is panicking. And somewhere behind all of it, someone is watching the hornet swarm. Because the CIA believes its mission is simple: find Jo, bring her home, and punish whoever took her. But the evidence suggests the real mission is much bigger. They need to discover why Jo was taken. They need to discover who ordered it. They need to discover why she's being kept alive. And most importantly, they need to figure out whether the Russians are actually the ones running the operation. Because if they're not, then everything we've watched so far has been a distraction. Jo's kidnapping isn't the war. It's the opening move. And the moment the CIA finally realizes who they're really fighting may be the moment they discover they've already been fighting the wrong enemy.